Hi everyone and welcome to another video from Neovim series. Today we're going to tackle LSP. This was by far the most popular video idea that you guys voted for. So here it is. Let's start. First of all, a fair warning. Playing around with LSP is not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of config involved and I wish Neovim future versions would make it a little bit more easier. It's not that hard as it used to be, but there's a lot of concepts you need to understand to actually set it up. But no worries, we are going to show you all the necessary concepts and we're going to take it step by step. One important note, although we will focus on LSP in this presentation and demo, there are adjacent concepts that come hand in hand with LSP, namely completion and code snippets. I will mention those things, but they are something that you have to keep in mind, that those things complement each other, and also debugging, which I talked about in the previous video about plugins. You should watch this. The playlist will be in the video description with all the other videos that I've recorded so far. All right, then we're going to talk about some must-have plugins. Thankfully, it's just a handful of those. And we're going to go through existing config, create some, read some, and hopefully this would give you enough understanding to get started with your own config. And at the end of the video, be able to have a fully functioning LSP setup for your language of choice. Thankfully, there's already a really good starter pack for this config and other Neovim configurations. I highly recommend using Kickstart NVim. And there are others like NVim distributions, but I find Kickstart to be a little bit better because it just gives you a sane default values for NVim, and then from there you can take it on your own. All right, so let's see how this works. Let me make it a little bit smaller. So what is LSP, first of all? LSP stands for Language Server Protocol, and this was originally created by Microsoft. The whole idea was to standardize somewhat how servers and development tools communicate around language features and facilities. So previously we had a scenario where each IDE would have to implement essentially their own set of language support features, things like go-to definition, renaming, and so on. But with the invention of LSP, this is now a little easier. So at one hand, editor creators like Neovim or others can focus on implementing a client for the language server, and then we can have a separate language server protocol tools that can run on your machine and connect. So essentially it forms a contract between your editor and the language of choice. So you have a separate process running somewhere on your machine, and then you have a client that connects to this process and then exchange information between the process and the editor. Those are standardized messages that the language server protocol recommends, and both parties can kind of collaborate like that. So this little diagram shows how it works. In a nutshell, really, you start NVim. Before starting, you install an LSP program. We'll see how it's being done. When you start Neovim and launch the internal LSP client, configure it, then it connects to the external program, and then they start collaborating on your file or on your directory on your workspace. So that's kind of how LSP works in a nutshell. What does LSP do in Neovim and how it looks like? So let's see. We have kind of three main components. So Neovim comes with pre-built LSP client. Most of the API is in the vim.lsp namespace in Lua. Kind of namespace, not really a namespace, but just a place where you can access those APIs. We have also related API in diagnostics, and something that is not part of the LSP client, but is necessary, in my opinion, to make things work, is Neovim LSP Config, which is a plugin that enables us to configure various settings for the LSP servers. And this gives us a few commands starting from LSP. Let's see this in action. So here, for example, I can open the greeter module, which we worked on the last video here. And this is just a simple Lua module, and I have configured my Neovim to work with Lua and also provide an LSP facility. So first of all, let's use the LSP command and LSP info to see if we have our Lua server attached here. And we can see config Lua ls. This is an external client that runs on my machine, and it provides a language server protocol compliant features that Neovim can consume. So we have this guy running, and it says that it's auto start true and it's attached to my file currently. This can take a while to load, so sometimes there might be a hiccup that you start working and the LSP is not yet loaded, but we can see if it's gonna work. So how can we work with it without setting any shortcuts that you might have seen earlier? People like clicking a shortcut, and we're gonna get through it. But let's just explore the LSP by itself. So we can drop here, go to Lua, and then Vim LSP, and then buff. You can see I have an auto completion here, and buffer essentially gives us a way to execute various LSP commands on the current buffer. So if I go to document symbol, let me reload this. As I said, sometimes it just doesn't really work for the first time. Let's reopen the file, do a good old E to reload it. Let's try it again. There we go. So here we have document symbol, which is one of the LSP features, and essentially gives me like a list that is integrated with the quick fix list, what symbols I have, what variables and functions and so on. So we have this local variable m on line 1. We have a function greet on line 3, and within the function we have a parameter that the LSP is discerning. So already from this simple file we can see that LSP gives us some initial diagnostics, and we could use it like that. We could just type commands lua, then vim.lsp, and then do other things like this. Let's try to do something that is a little different here. So if I make a mistake here, you can see that, make it a little bit bigger. Here is a warning flag, and here I have unidentified global RINT because there is no such command. So if we don't want to see the warnings, we can do lua vim diagnostics, and then we say disable, and then the diagnostics disappear. So this is something that you have to keep in mind. You can play around with those APIs and play around with diagnostics APIs, and they essentially form the core of the client experience within Neovim. All right, but obviously we want to first enable the diagnostics, and let's go back to the presentation, fix this. So we don't want to type it like that, right? So later we'll see how this can be automated, but that's a good start to explore those commands like this. A little bit more about LSP. We have LSP info that you've seen, and you can also have LSP log. That is very useful if you have problems setting it up. You can see all the logs in LSP that come out from this process. All right, let's swap back the presentation. Let's talk about LSP features. So we've seen how you can play around with it in Lua and in Neovim, what APIs are there. Now, LSP features are different for different languages and implementations. Generally, the language server protocol specifies various capabilities that language servers can implement, and those are things like go-to declaration or definition, list implementation, references, display function signature information, rename, perform various code actions, format, and more. We will see how to set it up, but that's kind of the idea for LSP in general. If you used to program in other editors, those are things that you take for granted. Those are just things that are there. In Neovim, you have to make a little bit of config to make it work. So plugins, as I mentioned, there are a few plugins that are important, and there's of course much more than I'm showing here. But those two are something that we definitely should have. So first of all is Meson Envim. This is a plugin that manages external tools, LSP servers among them, and configures them, integrates them with Neovim. Otherwise, you would have to kind of manually install them first, go to a web page, find an LSP, install it, and then perform some configuration. Additionally, optionally, you can install Meson -lspconfig.envim. This is like a bridge plugin that feels a little bit of a glue between the LSP config plugin and Meson. And finally, and probably most importantly, Envim LSP config. This is a plugin that essentially enables you to configure various LSPs, because they, out of the box, they come with some default settings, and you would otherwise have to configure them in the place where they are installed, and then somehow bring this back to Neovim, whereas Neovim LSP config enables you to do this from within Neovim. So again, let's see how those things look like. So first of all, I can type Meson, and you can see here I have like this nice little window here, and I can click 2. It shows me all the LSPs that I have installed. Again, they are installed somewhere on my machine. I have LSPs for Go, for Rust, for Python, Lua, and so on and so forth. So all those LSPs are discoverable, and you can see in this available tab here, I can search for more LSPs. I can show their documentation and so on. So I believe with I can install it and so on. I can of course search with Control F. The UI is pretty self-explanatory here. I think if I click enter, I can see a little bit more information. So there's a homepage here, there's a version installed, and other info. As you can see on top here, we have other things like DAP or linters or formatters. You can, install all kinds of things. So, but today we're interested in LSP. That's your first kind of experience. You install Meson as a plugin, and you install whatever LSP you want to have. And it's quite easy and really useful plugin to have. Okay, so that's Meson. Now let's look at LSP config. So I'm going to switch to my Neovim configuration, and then LSP, and this probably will be LSP config, LSP setup here in this file. I already have it opened in different session, but that's kind of to give you an overview in a nutshell. This is configuration that once you install, when you've seen earlier, Meson has this Lua LS. So let me open Meson again, and you can see that we have here in installed LSPs, Lua language server, Lua LS. So in order to configure this Lua LS, if I want to have some different features or different behavior, or just to register with Neovim, I would use this plugin, and those are various configuration capabilities that you can see. We have some warnings from LSP, which is quite helpful. You can read about the configuration and what's possible on the Envim LSP config plugin webpage, and we are going to look into this a little bit deeper. So those are, let's say 2 plugins that you definitely should look into, and 1 optional plugin. It requires just a little bit of setup to start working. All right. As I mentioned, LSP comes hand in hand with completion and with snippets. So this is outside of the scope of this video, but I might create another one just to dedicate it for the CMP plugin, which stands for completion, that provides various sources for auto-completion in Neovim. And one of the sources is LSP. However, LSP has built-in completion feature that the CMP plugin kind of binds to. And I want to show you how this can be done. So here, let's stay in this file, and let's imagine that I want to auto-complete something here. So in order to do this, I can call this function, this Vim LSP buff completion, only in insert mode. So I can put here Control O, and then I will be able to drop to command line in insert mode, and again Lua, Vim LSP, buff, and then completion. And then you see that displays kind of this little screen here with some errors because I shouldn't access this feature in this way. I'm accessing it through my CMP plugin, but it's possible to do this like that. So since I have my CMP plugin configured, this experience looks a little different for me. You can see I have some icons here and kind of all the auto completion. For example, the function comes from the language server protocol. But again, I don't want to focus on auto completion today, just to give you a heads up that this is something that is very important when you set up your full experience. That's why I mentioned that it would be great if Neovim somehow standardizes this or brings this bundles this up with the editor better, because it's still quite some fiddling that you have to do to make it work. All right. So there are various ways how you can approach setting up the Neovim configuration, which is part of the Neovim LSP config plugin. The typical recommendation is just to put it somewhere in your Lua file. But how I like to do this is I like to create a separate module. I've recorded a video about creating your own modules. It's part of the playlist that should be in the video description. You can watch it if you want. But what it does essentially, we are going to create a separate module with default capabilities that are available for any LSP client. This might sound esoteric, but bear with me, it's going to be a little bit easier once we start doing it. So first of all, let's create an empty buffer here, and then I'm going to simulate typing for this default LSP. So we're gonna go through this paragraph by paragraph. So first of all, it's a module that we are starting with. So we are going to create a default LSP configuration for our Neovim so that it knows what to do and what shortcuts and kind of what things to do. So first of all, obviously we start with the typical idiomatic module declaration. After that, again, this is part of the capabilities of the CMP, but the default capabilities essentially are what every LSP server should provide. The LSP server can provide more or less capabilities depending on the implementation, but from the CMP point of view, from the completion, we want to have kind of like a standard set of capabilities so that you can autocomplete with those. This line sets the log level for the LSP log feature that we've seen earlier. This should be set to something like warning, so you don't produce too much logs. However, if you are troubleshooting, something's wrong, then you should change this to debug, and then you would have many more logs to go through. All right, so this is not LSP specific, but I like creating this little custom function that I call nmap, which is mapping in normal mode. This gives me a little easier way of creating mapping in some cases and prepends the LSP to the description. So the first thing that you want to do if you create your LSP settings, you want to create various key maps. So here, for example, maybe before creating key maps, we create an omnifunc. Omnifunc is a function in Neovim or Vim as well that provides autocompletion without the completion plugin. So you can do Control X, Control E, I believe, or O rather, Control X, Control O to get into this auto completion mode. Again, using it with CMP is much nicer and much more configurable, but that exists and it's available. So other mappings, as you can see, I'm just providing a bunch of mappings that will be available anytime an LSP server is attached to our buffer, as you've seen me showing with LSP info. So things, for example, like open square brace D would use this command, going to previous diagnostics if we have errors, as we've seen earlier in the warning, and then close square brace D would go to next diagnostics and so forth. So we have like our own set of key bindings that we will carry over everywhere LSP is attached. And you can see that this is a pretty language agnostic. That's why it makes sense to create this default file. There is, however, a small caveat. Some languages, Rust specifically, are a bit special in the way how they invoke commands, and you might want to create a separate file for Rust. But other languages can reuse this configuration. All right, we can create more bindings, and this is essentially kind of gives us a way to integrate and interact nicely with the LSP functionality through our typical key maps. So you can see, for example, I can call create a call to code action. I can go to definition. Here is like a bit more creative, same go to definition, but in a split window. So I can have both buffers open. I can go to implementation. I can check incoming calls, outgoing. Here, for example, I can integrate LSP references as a telescope plugin rather than calling the buff LSP references directly. There's kind of various ways you can spice it up a little bit and make those mappings a bit more interesting. But at the end, those are the most important parts. Those are those mappings that you kind of bring with you and you configure on every LSP client that is attached. Here, just a few other mappings that are a little bit less useful or less known. For some languages, workspaces are important. This essentially means on what folders should LSP act. That's kind of the idea here. Control F is also formatting. You can have something more for diagnostics. Maybe you want to enable and disable diagnostics with the key binding. Those are the things you can put in this file. Here, for example, I also put the key binding for toggling a breakpoint. So as you can see, this comes from DAP, which is, it's not really LSP. It's more like a debugging, but you just bundled it into one. And then at the end, we return our module. And that's kind of the overall idea how you could use this default setting and just have it. So how do we use it? So let's, for example, go back to our LSP setup here. And you can see I have in this line default. So I am requiring this module. And when I set up my LSP, in this case for Lua, instead of repeating all the capabilities and the on-attach, which is what you've seen me typing earlier, when we attach to LSP buffer, then all those shortcuts and all the other features will be available. So I'm just bringing it on as a Lua module so I don't repeat all those settings. So that's kind of the core of setting up LSP ready. Okay. So we've seen how those things look like. Let me change this here. So last thing that we can do is maybe see it in action, how it could look like in a sample Go file. So let's go out from this. We don't want to save it. And then we have this little Go file here. I think it's file 6. Right, so that's a Go file. And we have LSP loaded. You can see that there's some errors here. And there's also on this line something which we will talk about later. That's inlay hint. But Okay, so we have those. We have LSP attached. We can confirm it, of course, by doing LSP info, and we can see we have GitHub Copilot, which is disabled, and we have go please LSP attached to our buffer. So since we have those things, let's maybe try to go to definition. So remember, we can still do this like the typing way. So we can Lua, Vim, LSP, buff, and then definition. And then that would be one way of going to definition, but we can also say, for example, go D, so GD. I think we have to, oh, there we go. So we went to, no, that's wrong command. Sorry for that. This is one thing that is finicky with this, that you often have to restart the file in order for LSP to kind of load correctly one more time. But it just what it is. Okay, so we are actually in the definition of this method because it's an interface. But if we go a little bit lower here to the implementation, and then we do go to definition, which is GD. Oh, GD. Oh, I'm not sure why it doesn't work, but it doesn't. So let's see. Go to definition is GD, and that should definitely work. Let's check on this method, GD. Okay, this worked. So this is part of the Go library, which we went to a definition of the function called background in the context object. I think I know why it doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work is because we have errors here. So if you have errors in your file, then the LSP might not work properly. So you first have to fix the error. So let's just fix this error. And then if we go to definition, this should somewhat work better. It doesn't really want to work for us. That's okay. What else we can do? We can, for example, check references. So GR would check the references. You can see that this is in various files. So if we go to this AICMD file, it is a reference that uses our command. If we go to definition now it worked. Okay, so we were able to go to definition from different file. How about displaying some help? We can do Shift K, which gives us this nice Go help. But once we move the cursor, it disappears. Sometimes it's useful to keep this window open. You can do this with double-clicking Shift K, so Shift and KK. Now we are in this little window, so I can go, for example, here, and then I could go and open a web page or copy a code snippet and go back like that. So that's LSP in action. We had a little bit of hiccup with going to definition here. And again, you can see some of the things need a little bit of time until the LSP loaded. So it's still a bit finicky. It's not that hard. Once you get it done, it's working quite well. But this is something that that is definitely still, could be improved in Neovim. And I'm sure that Neovim Core will improve it in future releases. All right, I want to show you one last bonus tip here. So there is something called inlay function, inlay hints. So if we go back to the file and I do .ih, you can see that I have this grayed out inlay hints that tell me, for example, this variable response, what object type is it, which is quite useful in some cases. All right, so that was it. Not sure why our logo doesn't show well. There you go. So that's it, folks. That was a little bit difficult, I imagine. Again, it's not for the faint of heart. There is some configuration involved. It's not also that hard, but in all fairness, there is a little bit of tweaking and fiddling here, and most of all learning, which I find quite good actually. I will leave you a link to my .files in the video description, so you can check out my .files, and again, definitely check out kickstarter.nvim. this configuration is just awesome, and it would be a good starting point for you. So I hope this video helped you understand what LSP is, see it in action, see the good sides of LSP, see some little hiccups along the way, which is part of why we all love Vim, right? Something that we can spend our weekends and tweak the config files. However, it's definitely worth it, and I program in Go using Nevoim and LSP, and I'm happy I don't miss on other editors and other features, specifically from LSP point of view. All right, thank you everyone for sticking till the end. Please leave me a comment. What do you think about the LSP? Did it help you set it up your own? And what are your experience with Nevoim LSP? Thanks, and see you in next video.